Have you ever caught yourself judging someone for not being at the same level of consciousness as you? Have you felt that silent discomfort when someone shares a material achievement while you're seeking deeper purpose and meaning? Perhaps you've experienced that sensation of being a few steps ahead on the personal development journey, looking down with a mixture of compassion and superiority disguised as empathy. It's subtle. It starts with seemingly harmless thoughts like, "They haven't understood what really matters yet," or "I'm at another level of understanding." You rationalize that it's not arrogance, it's just recognition of your own evolution. But there's something disturbing about this dynamic, something that Maslow discovered when he studied people who reached the highest levels of human development. That should make you question whether you're really climbing the ladder of the hierarchy or just building a pedestal to feed your ego. The cruel irony is that the more you feel this spiritual superiority, the further you are from the true self-actualization you seek so desperately. It's like climbing a mountain believing you're at the summit when in reality you've gotten lost on a side plateau, admiring the view while the real peak remains unreachable. This false sense of arrival is one of the most treacherous paradoxes of the personal development journey, and it may be sabotaging your ability to achieve what you most desire. The need to feel superior, even when disguised as spiritual enlightenment, reveals something profound about where you really are in the hierarchy of needs, and it's not where you imagine. Maslow's most unsettling discovery wasn't about how many levels exist in the hierarchy of needs. It was about how people who reach the higher levels can regress in almost imperceptible ways by developing what he called growth neuroses, and why the clearest sign that you haven't yet reached true self-actualization is precisely feeling that you're spiritually above others. Today I'm going to show you how the trap of spiritual superiority works, why it's actually a sophisticated form of unsatisfied esteem, needs disguised as evolution, and how the truly self-actualized people that Maslow studied demonstrated exactly the opposite, a humility so profound that it completely transformed how they related to the world and to themselves. This isn't just abstract psychological theory. It's a merciless mirror that can reveal where you really are on your journey, and why that feeling of being evolved might be exactly what's preventing your real evolution. Abraham Maslow spent years studying Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the most influential women of the 20th century, a central figure in the fight for human rights, and a frequent example used by the psychologist when discussing self-actualization. What fascinated Maslow wasn't her political power or her social influence. It was how she carried herself among people from all walks of life. In his detailed observations documented in the late 1940s and early 1950s, Maslow noted something that contradicted everything the popular culture of self-improvement suggested about successful people. Eleanor Roosevelt, despite her immense accomplishments and recognized wisdom, never positioned herself as superior to anyone. When speaking with a cleaning lady at the United Nations or with a world leader, her posture remained identical. There was no condescension disguised as kindness, no subtle tone suggesting she was doing someone a favor by paying attention to them. Maslow observed that she listened with the same genuine interest to a child's question as she did to a policy advisor's recommendation. This wasn't a learned technique or a political strategy. It was something deeper, something that revealed a fundamental truth about real development. The people who had truly reached the higher levels of the hierarchy, those Maslow called self-actualized, didn't need to feel superior because their sense of worth came from an entirely different source. They had transcended the need for external validation that keeps most people trapped in the esteem level, constantly comparing themselves to others to confirm their value. Eleanor Roosevelt's humility wasn't weakness or false modesty. It was the natural expression of someone who had satisfied the lower needs so completely that superiority simply made no sense anymore. There was no internal void demanding to be filled through comparison. She could see people as they were, not as pieces on a board where she needed to position herself higher. Maslow documented how this quality appeared consistently in every truly self-actualized person he studied. They possessed what he called democratic character structure, an ability to learn from anyone regardless of their social class, education, or status. But here's what makes this relevant to you right now. Most people climbing the hierarchy, especially those becoming aware of personal development and spiritual growth, fall into what Maslow identified as a dangerous trap. They confuse intellectual understanding of higher concepts with actual achievement of higher levels. They read about self-actualization, attend workshops, practice meditation, adopt spiritual vocabularies, and begin to genuinely grow. But somewhere in this process, a subtle distortion occurs. The growth itself becomes a new source of ego identification. The spiritual journey transforms into a ladder where you can position yourself above those who haven't yet awakened. You start categorizing people. There are those who are still stuck in materialism, trapped in basic needs, those who live for external approval, prisoners of the esteem level. And then there's you, walking the path of consciousness, seeking meaning, understanding the deeper game. This categorization feels good. It validates your efforts. It confirms that all those hours of introspection, all those difficult choices to prioritize meaning over money, weren't in vain. You're different. You're evolving. You're ahead. And this is precisely where the trap closes. Maslow discovered something crucial in his research on what he called the growth motivation versus deficiency motivation. People operating from deficiency motivation are trying to fill something that's missing. They seek safety because they feel unsafe. They pursue belonging because they feel isolated. They chase achievements and recognition because they feel inadequate. But people operating from growth motivation have already satisfied those deficiencies. They're not trying to prove anything or fill any void. They're simply expressing their nature, developing their potential for the sheer joy and meaning of the process itself. The critical insight that most people miss is this: needing to feel spiritually superior is a textbook sign of deficiency motivation. It reveals that you're still operating from the esteem level, still trying to fill a void of feeling inadequate, just using spiritual progress as your measuring stick instead of money, status, or traditional success. The content has changed, but the mechanism remains identical. You're still comparing yourself to others to feel better about yourself. You're still dependent on a relative position to validate your worth. You're still trapped in a game of more and less, higher and lower. The truly self-actualized person doesn't play this game at all, not because they've decided to be humble as a virtue, but because they've transcended the need that makes the game compelling in the first place. Think about this carefully. When you feel that subtle satisfaction seeing someone stuck in materialism while you pursue meaning, what exactly are you feeling? When you mentally categorize people as conscious or unconscious, evolved or unaware, what need is being satisfied by that categorization? Maslow would tell you it's the same need a teenager satisfies by being part of the cool group, the same need an executive satisfies by having a bigger office than their colleague, the same need a religious person satisfies by believing they have the truth while others are lost. It's the esteem need, the need to feel valuable by comparison. The disguise is sophisticated, almost undetectable because you've wrapped it in genuinely valuable concepts like consciousness, awareness, and growth. But strip away the spiritual vocabulary and the mechanism is ancient and primitive. You're establishing a hierarchy with yourself near the top to feel safe from the terror of insignificance. Here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. Maslow observed that this trap is almost inevitable for people moving from level 4, the esteem level, toward level 5, self-actualization. It's a transitional phase, a kind of spiritual adolescence. You've outgrown the crude forms of ego validation like wealth and status, but you haven't yet fully transcended the need for ego validation itself. So you find more subtle, sophisticated ways to feed the same need. You become the most conscious person in your social circle. You're the one who understands what others don't. You're awake while they sleep. This phase can last years, even decades. Many people get permanently stuck here, building entire identities around being spiritually advanced, creating communities of similarly stuck individuals who validate each other's superiority while calling it higher consciousness. The ultimate irony is that this trap prevents the very breakthrough it pretends to represent. True self-actualization requires what Maslow called self-forgetfulness, a state where you're so absorbed in something beyond yourself, a cause, a creative work, a relationship, a calling, that the question of where you rank simply doesn't arise. Eleanor Roosevelt wasn't thinking about her level of consciousness when she fought for human rights. She was absorbed in the work itself, in the meaning of the cause. Viktor Frankl, another of Maslow's examples, wasn't comparing his spiritual evolution to other concentration camp survivors. He was trying to preserve meaning and help others find it in the most meaning-destroying circumstances imaginable. The self-actualized person is characterized by what Maslow called mission-oriented rather than ego-oriented. Their energy flows towards something that matters to them, something beyond personal validation. And in that flow, in that genuine absorption, the ego structure that demands superiority simply dissolves. It's not suppressed or transcended through effort. It becomes irrelevant. Now let me show you how this plays out in modern life, because the patterns Maslow identified 70 years ago have only intensified in our current culture, obsessed with optimization, consciousness, and personal growth. Consider someone, let's call her Sarah, a 34-year-old marketing professional who 3 years ago had what she describes as an awakening. She started reading Eckhart Tolle, practicing mindfulness, questioning the rat race she'd been running. She made real changes. She simplified her life, reduced work hours, prioritized experiences over possessions. This was genuine growth, a legitimate move from being controlled by external validation towards seeking internal meaning. But gradually something shifted. Sarah started noticing how unconscious her colleagues were, how trapped in ego games, how blind to what really matters. She could see their suffering, their addiction to status and approval. She felt compassion, but beneath the compassion was something else. A subtle satisfaction, a sense of having figured out something they hadn't. She began speaking differently, using terms like presence and awareness and consciousness in ways that subtly positioned her as the one who gets it. When friends discussed promotions or purchases, she'd offer gentle observations about the hedonic treadmill, about how true fulfillment doesn't come from external things. She was technically correct. But the way she delivered these truths, the slight tone of someone explaining reality to people still lost in illusion, revealed something. She was using spiritual concepts the way someone else might use a luxury car as a marker of superior status. At dinner parties, she became the one who'd gently redirect materialistic conversations toward deeper questions. She'd share insights from her meditation practice, recommend books, suggest retreats. Her friends started experiencing her presence as vaguely exhausting, though they couldn't quite articulate why. Some distanced themselves. Sarah interpreted this as their resistance to growth, their discomfort with someone reflecting their unconsciousness back to them. She found new communities, spiritual circles where everyone spoke the same language, validated the same hierarchy of consciousness. She felt at home, but Maslow would recognize what was happening. Sarah had climbed from level 3, the belonging need, through level 4, the esteem need, and gotten stuck in a sophisticated version of level 4 that mimicked level 5. She needed to feel spiritually superior the way she once needed to feel professionally successful. The metric had changed, but the mechanism remained identical. She was still playing the comparison game, still dependent on positioning herself above others to feel secure in her value, still operating from deficiency rather than growth. The real breakthrough would come not from accumulating more spiritual knowledge or practices, but from recognizing this mechanism itself and seeing how it revealed what was still unsatisfied underneath. Hola, I know this might be hitting close to home. Have you ever caught yourself feeling just a little bit superior because you're working on yourself while others seem trapped in unconscious patterns? Have you felt that mix of compassion and judgment when someone shares excitement about something you've moved beyond? If this resonates with you, leave a simple comment. I've felt this. Your experience might be exactly what someone needs to read today to feel less alone. You have more healing power than you imagine. The pattern Maslow identified appears in every domain where people are genuinely growing. In the therapy world, people who've done extensive personal work can develop what therapists call helper's high, a subtle superiority toward those who haven't done the work. In the business world, entrepreneurs who've achieved financial independence can feel quietly superior to those still working traditional jobs. In the intellectual world, academics can feel superior to those with less education. In the spiritual world, Practitioners can feel superior to the unawakened masses. The content varies, but the structure is identical. Someone makes real progress in some dimension of development, and instead of that progress leading to greater humility and connection, it becomes a new source of separation and ego inflation. Maslow called this the Jonah complex, a fear of one's own greatness that manifests as stopping just short of true self-actualization and building a comfortable camp at a high but not highest level. Why would someone fear their own greatness? Because true self-actualization requires letting go of the ego structures that have carried you this far. It requires a kind of death, the death of the self that needs to be special, superior, ahead of others. That self has been your companion, your protector, your motivator. It's terrifying to let it go, even when intellectually you understand it's necessary. So people stop just short. They achieve enough growth to feel significantly advanced, but not enough growth to transcend the need to feel advanced. They build impressive spiritual resumes, accumulate practices and insights, surround themselves with the trappings of higher consciousness. But the core mechanism of ego validation through superiority remains untouched, just dressed in increasingly sophisticated garments. Maslow documented a different pattern in people who broke through this trap. There was always a moment, sometimes a crisis, sometimes a gradual realization, where they confronted the gap between their spiritual self-image and their actual internal experience. They saw the game they were playing, the way they were using growth itself as a new form of ego protection. This confrontation was profoundly humbling, not in a self-flagellating way, but in a way that cut through years of sophisticated self-deception. One of Maslow's subjects described it as falling off the spiritual ladder and realizing there was never a ladder in the first place, just different ways of being human. Another described it as seeing that my need to feel evolved was the least evolved thing about me. These moments of recognition didn't destroy their genuine growth. The insights remained, the practices continued, the values stayed authentic. But something fundamental shifted in how they held it all. The growth became something they experienced rather than something they possessed. It was no longer armor against inadequacy. It was simply the natural unfolding of their potential, no more special or superior than a tree growing toward light. This shift changed everything about how they related to others. They could meet people exactly where they were without that subtle internal movement of comparison and positioning. They could genuinely appreciate someone's joy in a material achievement without mentally categorizing them as stuck in lower needs. They could learn from anyone because they weren't protecting a position of superiority that might be threatened. The humility wasn't practiced or performed. It was the spontaneous result of having nothing left to prove. Let me show you what this looks like in practice because it's easy to romanticize but harder to embody. Maslow spent time with Abraham Joshua Heschel, the rabbi and theologian who marched with Martin Luther King Jr. and devoted his life to interfacing spirituality with social justice. What struck Maslow was how Heschel engaged with people who disagreed with him, even those operating from what might be considered less developed perspectives. He didn't argue from a position of spiritual authority. He didn't subtly communicate that he saw reality more clearly than they did. He entered genuine dialogue, curious about their experience, open to being changed by the encounter. In one documented exchange, a young activist challenged Heschel's religious framework, calling it outdated mysticism. Instead of defending his position or educating the young person about the depths they hadn't yet understood, Heschel asked questions. He wanted to know what the activist had experienced that led to this conclusion. He listened without the subtle facial expressions that communicate patient tolerance of someone who doesn't get it yet. And then he shared his own experience, not as truth that should be adopted, but as one human being offering another human being a window into their inner world. The activist later described feeling truly heard for the first time in his life, and said it changed his relationship to spirituality entirely, not because Heschel convinced him of anything, but because he encountered someone whose depth didn't demand recognition or superiority. This is what genuine level 5 looks like. There's nothing to prove, no position to protect, no hierarchy to maintain, just authentic engagement with the reality in front of you. Maslow contrasted this with encounters he'd had with people who positioned themselves as spiritual teachers or guides while clearly operating from unacknowledged superiority needs. They used language of unity and oneness, while their entire communication style created separation. They spoke of ego dissolution, while their every interaction revealed a massive ego invested in being seen as ego-free. They taught humility with an air of authority that contradicted the teaching. Maslow noted that students often sensed this contradiction, but couldn't articulate it, feeling something off, but doubting their perception, because the teacher's credentials or reputation seemed to confirm their advancement. This created what he called mystification, where people distrust their own accurate perceptions because they conflict with someone's claimed level of development. The damage this causes is significant, not just to the students, but to the teachers themselves, who become increasingly trapped in personas they can't escape without admitting the gap between image and reality. The question that matters is, how do you know if you're stuck in this trap? Maslow offered several indicators, and they're uncomfortable to confront honestly. First indicator is how you respond internally when someone doesn't recognize your growth or insight. If you feel frustrated, dismissed, or misunderstood when people don't see how much you've evolved, that's a red flag. The self-actualized person doesn't need their growth recognized. It's not performed for an audience. Second indicator is whether you find yourself mentally categorizing people by their level of consciousness or development. If you habitually assess where others are on the hierarchy, you're still operating from comparison. The self-actualized person sees the unique expression of each individual, not their ranking on a ladder. Third indicator is how you feel when you encounter someone who seems more advanced than you in some dimension. If you feel threatened, competitive, or dismissive, you're protecting a position. The self-actualized person feels genuine appreciation and curiosity, excited to learn from someone with different gifts. Fourth indicator is whether your spiritual or personal growth practices have become a source of identity and pride. If meditation, therapy, reading, or any practice has become part of how you establish superiority, even subtly, you're using growth as ego fuel. The self-actualized person practices because the practice itself is meaningful, not because it confirms their advancement. Fifth indicator is how you speak about your insights and realizations. If there's a performance quality, a need to demonstrate your understanding, a subtle positioning of yourself as the one who gets it, you're still playing the game. The self-actualized person shares from genuine overflow, from a desire to connect and contribute, not from a need to establish status. These indicators aren't meant to create more self-judgment. That would just be another trap, feeling bad about feeling superior, which keeps the same mechanism running just with a negative charge. The point is simply to see clearly what's happening, to recognize the mechanism without adding a story about it. Maslow emphasized that this trap is developmentally normal. Almost everyone moving towards self-actualization passes through it. The danger is getting stuck, building your identity around being at this stage, surrounding yourself with validation that prevents you from seeing what's happening. The breakthrough comes from honest recognition, from seeing the game you're playing without justification or defense. And paradoxically, the moment you truly see it, the game starts losing its grip. It's hard to keep playing once you've seen the mechanism clearly. It's like trying to stay absorbed in a magic trick after the magician has shown you how it works. The satisfaction of feeling superior starts feeling hollow once you recognize it's just another form of the insecurity you thought you'd transcended. This recognition isn't a one-time event. The trap is sophisticated and keeps reappearing in subtler forms. You might recognize spiritual superiority and release it, only to develop superiority about being past superiority. You might transcend comparing yourself on consciousness and start comparing yourself on humility. The mechanism is tricky, adaptive, capable of co-opting any insight you have about it. The only real protection is ongoing honest self-examination, a willingness to keep questioning your motives, and a sense of humor about the whole thing. Maslow noted that self-actualized people could laugh at themselves, at the absurdity of the ego's strategies, without it being self-deprecating. They could see their own patterns with affectionate amusement, rather than harsh judgment or blind spots. Let me show you what the alternative looks like, because it's important to have a positive vision, not just a critique of the trap. Maslow studied Kurt Goldstein, the neurologist who actually coined the term self-actualization that Maslow later adopted and developed. What impressed Maslow was how Goldstein engaged with his patients. many of whom had severe brain injuries from World War I. Goldstein didn't relate to them as damaged or less than. He didn't position himself as the healthy one helping the sick. He approached each patient as a complete human being expressing their potential within their particular constraints. He was genuinely curious about how they made sense of their experience, how they adapted, what strategies they developed. He learned from them. In his writings, Goldstein described patients teaching him fundamental principles about human resilience and creativity that he never would have discovered through theory alone. This wasn't romanticizing their conditions or pretending limitations didn't exist. It was recognizing that development and actualization happen within whatever circumstances you face, and that someone navigating severe constraints with creativity and grace might have something important to teach someone with more conventional advantages. Goldstein's humility was the foundation of his genius. Because he didn't need to be the expert standing above patients, he could see what was actually happening in front of him, rather than what his theories predicted should happen. This led to breakthrough insights that shaped modern neuroscience and rehabilitation. The pattern appears over and over. The people who make genuine contributions, who create real impact, who help others grow, are characterized by this capacity to meet people where they are without subtle superiority. They can see the person in front of them, not the category or level. They can appreciate the unique expression of human potential in whatever form it takes. They don't need others to be less developed to feel secure in their own development. Maslow found this quality in jazz musicians, artists, scientists, activists, therapists, parents, teachers, people across every domain and walk of life. It wasn't correlated with education, wealth, status, or conventional success. It was correlated with having satisfied the lower needs thoroughly enough that growth became its own reward rather than a strategy for feeling superior. Here's a crucial point that trips people up. Recognizing that someone is operating from a different level of development isn't the same as feeling superior to them. Maslow wasn't suggesting you pretend everyone is the same, or deny obvious differences in consciousness, maturity, or capability. You can accurately perceive that someone is trapped in materialistic pursuits or consumed by status anxiety, or operating from fear. The question is what happens in you when you perceive that. Do you feel separate, above, relieved that you're not stuck there? Or do you feel connected, recognizing your own past or potential future patterns, curious about their experience, open to what you might learn even from their stuckness? The self-actualized person can hold both truths simultaneously. They can see clearly where someone is operating from while maintaining deep respect and connection to their humanity. They don't deny differences, but differences don't create superiority. It's like an adult watching a child struggle with something the adult finds easy. The adult doesn't feel superior to the child. They remember being that child. They recognize the child is doing exactly what children do. They might help, they might not, depending on what's appropriate, but there's no ego investment in being the more developed one. This is how self-actualized people relate across all differences. They can interact with someone operating from survival needs, belonging needs, esteem needs, or growth needs with the same basic respect and interest. They're not trying to fix, save, or elevate anyone unless explicitly asked to help. They're simply present to what is, responding authentically to each situation, learning from every encounter. The transformation from needing to be spiritually superior to embodying genuine humility isn't something you can force or perform. You can't will yourself into humility because the will to become humble is just another ego project, another way of establishing superiority, this time as the most humble. Maslow observed that this shift happens through continued engagement with reality, through allowing life to humble you naturally rather than constructing humility as an identity. It happens when you face situations that reveal your limitations despite all your growth. When you react with defensiveness, despite years of mindfulness practice. When you feel jealous, despite understanding its roots. When you judge others harshly despite your sophisticated psychology knowledge. These moments, if you let them land without immediately explaining them away or turning them into more self-improvement projects, gradually erode the fiction that you're fundamentally different from others. You start seeing that you have the same basic mechanisms, same fears, same defensive patterns, just with different content and expressions. This recognition could be depressing, a deflation of your special status. But Maslow found that for people who stay with the recognition, it becomes liberating. If you're not fundamentally different or special, you don't have to protect and maintain a position. You can relax. You can be ordinary. You can mess up without it meaning something about your level of development. You can learn from anyone because you're not protecting expertise. You can not know things without it threatening your identity. You can change your mind without losing face. You can be wrong without being diminished. The energy that was going into maintaining the position of superiority becomes available for actual engagement with life. And paradoxically, this is when real growth accelerates. When you stop being invested in being evolved, you become free to actually evolve. When you stop needing to be conscious, consciousness deepens naturally. When you stop positioning yourself as a head, you can finally be present to where you actually are, which is the only place growth happens. Maslow documented this pattern in his later work on transcendence, the movement beyond self-actualization. He found that people who reached what he called level 6 dominant transcendence were characterized by even deeper humility. They had experiences of unity, of dissolving boundaries between self and other, of recognizing their fundamental interconnection with all existence. These weren't beliefs or concepts, but lived experiences that permanently shifted their perception. And instead of making them feel special, these experiences made the concept of special meaningless. How can you feel superior to others when you've experienced that there is no fundamental separation, that the boundaries between you and them are conceptual overlays on an underlying unity? You can't. The transcendent experience itself dissolves the mechanism that creates superiority. This doesn't mean transcendent people never see differences or never recognize that they have capacities others don't have. A master musician knows they can play things that most people can't. An enlightened teacher knows they see patterns that students haven't recognized yet. But knowing this doesn't create a sense of superiority, just as your hand doesn't feel superior to your foot despite having different capabilities. They're different expressions of the same unified life, and all expressions are necessary and valuable. Maslow noted that people who had genuine transcendent experiences but interpreted them in ways that inflated their ego, who started identifying as enlightened or special, were actually having their transcendent experiences filtered through still active esteem needs. The experience was real, but the interpretation was contaminated. This created what he called spiritual materialism, using the highest experiences as the ultimate ego trophy. Genuine transcendence dismantles ego structure. It doesn't provide better fuel for ego inflation. Let me bring this back to practical reality, because these concepts can float into abstraction. What would it look like if you recognized this trap in yourself and started working with it honestly? First, you'd stop trying to transcend it through effort or practice. Trying to become more humble just creates another achievement to be proud of. Instead, you'd simply bring awareness to the mechanism when it appears. You'd notice the moment of feeling superior without making it wrong. You'd watch what triggers it, what situations bring it out, what insecurity it's trying to compensate for. This isn't analysis for the purpose of fixing, it's just looking clearly at what's happening. Second, you'd start questioning the thoughts that support the superiority. When you think they're so unconscious, you'd get curious about what you're protecting by thinking that. When you feel frustrated that someone doesn't get it, you'd examine what need isn't being met in you. When you position yourself as more evolved, you'd ask what would happen if you weren't. What would you lose? This inquiry isn't about reaching correct answers. It's about loosening the certainty that keeps the pattern locked in place. Third, you'd deliberately seek encounters with people you'd normally mentally categorize as less evolved and challenge yourself to find something to genuinely learn from them. Not as an exercise in forced humility, but as a real investigation. What do they know that you don't? What have they mastered that you haven't? What perspective do they have that you lack? This isn't pretending everyone knows everything or denying genuine differences. It's recognizing that knowledge and development are multidimensional, and everyone has some dimension where they exceed you. The person consumed by material success might know something profound about discipline and focus you haven't mastered. The one trapped in people-pleasing might understand human dynamics and relational nuance that escaped you. The colleague obsessed with status might have cracked codes of influence and persuasion you've dismissed as beneath you. Every human being is solving problems you're not solving, navigating terrain you haven't crossed, developing capacities in areas you've neglected. When you can genuinely see this, not as a practice, but as reality, the hierarchy collapses, and you're left in a field of peers, each with unique configurations of strengths and growing edges. So where does this leave you right now? You're reading these words and perhaps recognizing these patterns in yourself, feeling that uncomfortable mix of relief at being seen and resistance to what's being revealed. That's exactly where transformation happens, in that edge between recognition and defense. Your journey toward meaning and growth is real and valuable. The insights you've gained matter. The changes you've made count. Nothing about recognizing this trap invalidates your development, but it does invite a crucial shift in how you hold it all, from development as a means of separation to development as a path of deeper connection, from growth that positions you above to growth that opens you wider, from seeking consciousness to confirm your specialness to embodying consciousness that dissolves the need to be special at all. This shift doesn't happen through effort, but through continued honest looking, through letting life humble you naturally, through staying soft where you've been getting hard, through choosing again and again to meet what's in front of you without the filter of comparison.